The phone rang at 2:13 in the morning, a time when nothing good ever comes from the other end of the line. I stared at the screen for a second before answering, already knowing it was my son, and when I picked up I did not say hello, I just listened. Because after 40 years of being a mother you learn the difference between a call that can wait and a call that cannot. His voice came through tight, strained, nothing like the confident man he had become. Mom, they are taking everything, the house, the business, even the kids' college fund. I closed my eyes and let the silence sit for just a moment, not because I did not care, but because I had heard this tone before, not from him, but from clients. From people who had waited too long to understand what risk really meant. I stood up slowly, walked to the kitchen, and rested my hand on the counter where the wood had worn smooth over the years. "Do you still have the blue folder I gave you?" I asked. There was a pause on the other end, longer than it should have been. "I think so," he said, but it sounded like a guess, not an answer. I nodded even though he could not see me. Of course it was a guess. 10 years ago when I handed it to him, he barely looked at it. Vanessa had laughed softly and said something about paperwork and worst-case scenarios. I remember that night clearly. Thanksgiving, the table full, the kind of evening that looks perfect in photos. My grandson had just turned 8. My granddaughter was coloring at the corner of the table, and Vanessa leaned back in her chair with a glass of wine and said, "Eleanor sells fear for a living." I smiled. The way you do when you decide not to correct someone who is not ready to understand. Mark had chuckled, not cruelly, just casually, like it was easier to agree than to think about it. I did not argue. I never do, not because I have nothing to say, but because I learned a long time ago that people only hear what they're ready to hear. I built my career one rejection at a time, driving across neighborhoods in Ohio, knocking on doors, sitting at kitchen tables with families who did not think they needed me until something went wrong. I was 39 when I started, divorced, no degree, just a son to raise and a stack of bills that did not care how tired I was. I remember eating lunch in my car more days than I can count, fast food wrappers on the passenger seat, a notebook full of names and numbers, and the quiet understanding that stability is not loud. It does not show up in luxury cars or vacation photos. It shows up in moments like this, at 2:13 in the morning when everything else starts to fall apart. "Mom, what do I do?" Mark asked, and for the first time in years he sounded like the boy who used to sit at the edge of my bed when he had a nightmare. I turned toward the hallway and looked at the small cabinet where I kept my own files, neat, labeled, untouched for months. "Open the blue folder," I said, and read the first page out loud. There was movement on the other end, drawers opening, papers shifting. And then silence again, heavier this time, as if something inside that folder had just changed the direction of his night. I waited, because I knew what he was seeing, and I knew what it meant, and after a long breath he said, "Mom, I think this might save us." I did not smile. I did not say "I told you so." I just rested my hand on the counter and let the moment settle, because this was never about being right. It was about being prepared, and for the first time in a very long time, my son was finally looking at what I had spent my life building. He did not speak for a few seconds after that, and I could hear the faint sound of paper moving, the kind of careful movement people make when they realize something in their hands might matter more than they first thought. Then he cleared his throat. "Mom, why do I not remember this?" I leaned against the counter and looked out the window into the quiet street. "Because you did not think it was important," I said calmly, and I did not say it to hurt him. It was simply the truth. 10 years ago he was busy building his business, chasing contracts, meeting investors, trying to prove that he was not just the son of a woman who sold insurance. I remember the day I gave him that folder. It was a Sunday afternoon. He had just closed his first major deal. And Vanessa was already talking about upgrading the house, adding a pool, maybe even moving into a better neighborhood. I sat at their kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and explained the basics: liability exposure, long-term protection, how one unexpected event could shift everything overnight. Mark nodded politely, the way people do when they are listening, just enough to be respectful, but not enough to actually absorb what is being said. Vanessa did not even pretend. She leaned against the counter scrolling through her phone and said, "We are not planning to fail Eleanor. We are planning to grow, I smiled then, not because I agreed, but because I had heard that sentence in different forms my entire career. People do not plan for the storm when the sky is clear. They plan for expansion, for upgrades, for the next level. I slid the blue folder across the table and told him to keep it somewhere safe, just in case. He asked me how much it cost. And when I told him the number, he hesitated for half a second, not because it was expensive, but because it felt unnecessary. Still, he signed, more out of habit than belief. I remember driving home that evening with the radio low and the sun setting behind me, thinking that maybe one day he would understand why I insisted, not because I expected gratitude, but because I knew what it felt like to stand in a room where everything you built was suddenly at risk. I had seen it too many times, families sitting across from me with folders just like that one, wishing they had taken one more step before it was too late. On the phone now I could hear him flipping through the pages, reading words that used to mean nothing to him: coverage, protection, beneficiary, terms that sound boring until they become the only thing standing between you and losing everything. Mom, this policy covers the business structure, he said slowly, as if he was translating a language he had never learned. Yes, I replied. It was designed to protect exactly this situation. There was another pause, and this one felt different, heavier, like realization settling in piece by piece. Vanessa is here, he added. And I could hear her voice faintly in the background, sharper now, asking questions, urgent, no longer amused. I closed my eyes for a moment and let that sink in. 10 years ago, she laughed at the idea of needing something like this. Tonight she was asking how it worked, how fast it could help, what it meant for their future. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt something quieter, something steadier, the confirmation that all those years of being overlooked did not erase the value of what I knew. Mark spoke again, softer this time. Mom, can you come in tomorrow morning? We need you to explain this to the lawyer. I opened the cabinet and looked at my own files, perfectly arranged, every detail in its place. I will be there at 8, I said. And after we hung up, I stood there for a while in the silence of my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had spent years organizing paperwork that no one in my family ever asked about, until tonight, until now. When those same papers had become the only thing they could hold on to, I arrived at Mark's office at exactly 8 in the morning. The parking lot already half full, even though the sun had barely cleared the buildings. I sat in my car for a moment before getting out. Not to gather courage, but to settle into the calm that comes from knowing exactly why you are there. Inside the building, everything felt different from the last time I visited. The energy was tighter, quieter, like a place that had been running on confidence and suddenly realized confidence was not enough. Mark was waiting near the entrance, his shoulders slightly hunched, his phone in his hand but not in use. When he saw me, he stepped forward quickly, almost too quickly. Like he did not want me to notice the change in him. Mom, thank you for coming, he said, and there was something in his voice I had not heard in years. Not weakness, but respect trying to find its way back. I gave a small nod and followed him down the hallway, the walls lined with framed photos of projects he had completed, buildings that once represented growth, now reminders of everything at risk. Vanessa was already in the conference room with a man in a gray suit who stood up as we entered, his handshake firm but measured. He introduced himself as their attorney, and I could tell from the way his eyes moved between us that he was trying to understand how I fit into this situation. Mark placed the blue folder on the table in front of me, carefully this time, as if it carried weight he had only just recognized. We have been going through this, he said, but we need you to explain it. I opened the folder and smoothed the first page with my hand. A habit I had developed over decades of sitting across from people in moments just like this. The attorney leaned forward slightly. You structured this policy, he asked. I nodded. Yes, 10 years ago, designed to protect the business if a liability event exceeded their operational coverage. He glanced at Mark, then back at me. This could change everything, he said quietly. I began to walk them through it, not rushing, not dramatizing, just explaining each part the way I had done hundreds of times before. The coverage limits, the conditions, the clauses that most people skip until they need them. Vanessa sat across from me, her hands clasped tightly together, her expression focused in a way I had never seen before. There was no trace of the casual dismissal from years ago, only urgency, only the need to understand. "So this means we are not going to lose the house?" she asked, her voice softer now. "It means you have protection," I replied. "But protection only works if you follow the process correctly." The attorney nodded in agreement, confirming the steps we needed to take: timelines, documentation, coordination with the insurer, everything precise, everything dependent on details that used to seem unimportant. Mark leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, like someone who had been holding his breath for days. "I should have listened to you," he said, not looking at me directly, but not avoiding me either. I did not respond to that. Not because I did not hear it, but because this was not the moment for reflection. This was the moment for action. I turned to the next page and continued, outlining what needed to happen next, what could be saved, what still required careful handling, and as I spoke I noticed something shift in the room, the way they listened, the way they followed each word, not out of obligation, but out of trust, something that had not been there before. Something that had been earned quietly over years they never paid attention to. When I finished the explanation, the room fell into a brief silence, not uncomfortable, just full, as if everything had settled into place. The attorney gathered his notes and looked at Mark. "You are fortunate this was in place," he said. Mark nodded slowly, then looked at me, really looked this time, and in that moment I saw it clearly, not just relief, but understanding, the kind that does not come from being told, but from finally seeing for yourself what has always been there. We spent the next hour going through every detail, not once raising our voices, not once losing focus, because when everything is on the line there is no space for pride or old habits, only clarity, only decisions. The attorney made several calls while we sat there, confirming timelines, verifying clauses, making sure the policy would activate exactly as it was designed to. I watched Mark as he listened, really listened this time, not interrupting, not assuming he already knew what came next. And I realized how rare that had become, not just for him, but for many people who move too fast through their own lives to stop and understand what is holding everything together. Vanessa asked more questions than I expected, careful ones, precise ones, not the kind meant to challenge, but the kind meant to learn, and I answered each one the same way I always have, without judgment, without reminding her of the past, because this was not about being right. This was about making sure they could move forward. When the attorney finally set his phone down, he looked at us with a steady expression. "We have a path," he said. "It is not easy, but it is solid." And for the first time since I walked into that building, I saw Mark. Shoulders relaxed just slightly, not completely, but enough to show that the weight had shifted, enough to show that something had been stabilized. He turned to me again. "Mom, I do not even know how to thank you." I shook my head gently. "You do not need to thank me," I said. "This is what I do," and I meant that in more ways than one, not just the work itself, but the years behind it, the quiet consistency, the decisions made when no one was watching, the discipline of preparing for things that might never happen but sometimes do. We gathered the documents, organizing them into a plan that would carry them through the next few weeks, every step clear, every requirement written down, no assumptions, no shortcuts. As we stood up to leave the conference room, Vanessa hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer to me, her voice lower now, almost careful. "I am sorry," she said, and I could see that she meant it, not because she felt forced to say it, but because she finally understood what she had overlooked. I looked at her for a second, not searching for anything more, just acknowledging the moment, and then I gave a small nod. "It is all right," I said. Because holding on to that kind of thing would not change anything now, and it would not help them move forward. We walked out of the office together, the hallway quieter than before, the framed photos still hanging on the walls, but no longer carrying the same meaning. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter exactly, but clearer, like a storm had not passed, but had been understood. Mark stood beside his car and looked at me again, as if he wanted to say something more. Something that could make up for years of distance. But there are some things that do not need to be said all at once, some things that show themselves over time, through actions, through choices, through the way people listen when it matters. I opened my car door and paused for just a moment, looking at both of them, not as people who had dismissed me, but as people who had finally seen what had always been there. Then I got into my car and closed the door, the sound quiet but final. And as I started the engine, I realized that nothing about my work had changed. Nothing about what I had built was different than it was yesterday. The only thing that had changed was how they understood it, and sometimes that is the difference that matters most. The next few days moved in a rhythm that felt unfamiliar to them, but completely natural to me. Structured, deliberate, every step planned before the next one began. I returned to their office early the following morning with a list already prepared. Documents they needed, calls that had to be made, deadlines that could not be missed. Mark greeted me at the door again, but this time there was no hesitation in his posture, only focus. He had already cleared his schedule for the week. Something he would not have done before, something he never believed was necessary until now. Vanessa was at the table when I walked in, her laptop open, notes spread neatly in front of her. She stood up as I entered. Not out of formality, but out of recognition, the kind that grows quietly when perspective shifts. We sat down together and began working through the process, each item checked carefully, each requirement completed without delay. The attorney joined us midway through the morning and reviewed everything we had gathered, confirming that the claim process was moving forward exactly as it should. There was no rush in his voice now, no urgency driven by uncertainty, only a steady progression toward resolution. And that is what most people misunderstand. Protection does not remove difficulty, it organizes it. It gives structure to what would otherwise become chaos. By the third day, the first confirmation came through, partial approval, enough to stabilize the immediate pressure, enough to prevent the situation from escalating beyond control. Mark sat back in his chair when he read the email, his hands still for a moment before he let out a slow breath. I did not react, not outwardly. Because I have seen that moment many times before, the moment when fear begins to loosen its grip, when possibility returns quietly, without announcement. Vanessa looked at me across the table, her expression no longer guarded, just open. I did not know. It worked like this, she said. I nodded slightly. Most people do not until they need it. We continued through the rest of the week the same way, steady, consistent, no shortcuts, no assumptions. Each conversation handled with care, each decision grounded in facts rather than emotion. And with each passing day I noticed something changing, not just in the situation itself, but in how they carried themselves. Mark listened before speaking. He asked questions he would have once dismissed. He paused to consider outcomes instead of rushing toward the next opportunity. Vanessa moved through the details with a focus that replaced her usual confidence with something more grounded, more aware. On Friday afternoon we sat together as the final confirmation arrived. Full activation of the policy, complete protection within the defined limits. The foundation they thought they had lost now secure again. The room was quiet when the message appeared on the screen, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been understood. Mark looked at me, not searching for reassurance this time, but acknowledging something deeper, something that had been there long before this week began. I should have asked you sooner, he said quietly. I folded my hands on the table and looked back at him. It is not about asking sooner, I replied. It is about understanding when it matters. Vanessa closed her laptop slowly, as if marking the end of something that had changed her in ways she had not expected. We gathered the papers one last time, organizing them back into the folder that had sat untouched for years, and as I placed it in front of Mark I noticed how carefully he held it now, not as an afterthought, but as something that deserved attention, something that had proven its place. We walked out of the office together once more. The same hallway, the same walls, but nothing about it felt the same. Outside the air was cool, the late afternoon light stretching across the parking lot, and as I stood there for a moment before leaving I realized that the work itself had never been invisible. It had simply been overlooked, and now that it had been seen, it would not be forgotten again. The following week settled into something quieter, not the urgency of crisis, but the steady work of rebuilding, and for the first time in a long while Mark did not rush ahead of himself. He showed up early each morning, Reviewed every document twice, asked questions before making decisions. I watched him move through his own office differently, not as someone chasing the next opportunity, but as someone protecting what he already had. Vanessa changed in smaller ways. Less visible to anyone who did not know her well, she no longer filled the silence with quick opinions. She listened more, took notes, followed details through to the end. One afternoon, she stayed behind after a meeting and asked me to walk her through the policy again. Not because she doubted it, but because she wanted to understand it fully. I explained each section slowly, the same way I had done at kitchen tables and small offices for decades, and this time she did not interrupt. She did not look at her phone. She simply followed along, asking careful questions when something was not clear. It reminded me of the early days of my career, when I had to learn everything piece by piece, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I knew that understanding was the only thing that made the work meaningful. By the middle of the week, the financial pressure that had been building began to ease. Accounts stabilized. Legal concerns moved into structured timelines. Nothing disappeared overnight, but everything became manageable, and that is the difference people rarely see. They imagine solutions as sudden, dramatic, but most real solutions are quiet, built through systems that hold when everything else shakes. On Thursday, Mark asked if I could stay a little longer after the meetings. We sat in his office as the building emptied out, the late afternoon light stretching across the desk. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me in a way that felt unfamiliar, not distant, not distracted, just present. I used to think I had everything under control, he said slowly. I thought working harder would solve everything. I folded my hands in my lap and listened, because this was not about giving advice anymore. It was about letting him reach his own understanding, he continued. I never thought about what would happen if something went wrong. Not really, I nodded once. Most people do not, I said. It is easier to focus on growth than protection, easier to believe that momentum will carry you through anything. He looked down at the blue folder resting on his desk, now opened, used, no longer something to be set aside. I almost threw this away once, he admitted. I remember Vanessa saying it was unnecessary. I did not respond right away, not because I did not remember, but because I wanted him to sit with that thought for a moment. Then I said, but you did not, and sometimes that is enough. He let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, more like a release. I guess it is, he said. When I left that evening, the parking lot was nearly empty, the air cool, the sky beginning to fade into evening. I walked to my car at the same steady pace I always had. Nothing about my steps had changed. Nothing about my work had changed. The only difference was that now, when I walked away, I knew that what I had spent years building was no longer invisible to the people who mattered most, and that kind of change does not come from a single moment. It comes from everything that led up to it, from every door knocked on, every conversation held, every detail carefully put in place long before anyone realized why it mattered. By the time the second week began, the urgency had faded into something steadier, almost routine, but not the kind of routine they were used to. This one required attention, patience, and a willingness to slow down. Mark started arriving before anyone else in the office, not to impress anyone, but because he needed the quiet, the time to think. Before the day began pulling him in different directions, I noticed he no longer rushed through his mornings. He reviewed numbers carefully, asked his team more direct questions, and listened all the way through the answers, even when they were not what he wanted to hear. Vanessa shifted in a different way, less visible but just as real. She began organizing things at home, paperwork, accounts, small details that had once been left for later. One evening she invited me over for dinner, something she had not done in a long time. The house felt the same, but the atmosphere had changed, quieter, more grounded. There were no rushed conversations about expansion or upgrades, no casual remarks about success, just a simple meal. Carefully prepared, we sat at the table and for a while no one spoke, not because there was tension, but because there was nothing left to prove. After dinner, Mark brought out the blue folder again, placing it on the table between us. I noticed how he handled it now, not casually, not as something that could be pushed aside, but as something that required care. I have been reading through this every night, he said. Not because I have to, but because I want to understand it. I nodded slightly. That is how it works, I replied. Understanding does not come all at once. It builds over time. Vanessa looked at me then, her expression thoughtful. I used to think your work was just about selling something people might never need, she said slowly. I did not respond right away. I let her finish. Now I see it is about making sure they are not alone when something does happen. I gave a small nod. That is closer to it, I said. It is about making sure there is a plan when things do not go the way you expect. We sat there for a moment, the three of us, not as people separated by misunderstanding, but as people who had moved through something together. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave, Mark walked me to the door, the same way he used to when he was younger, before life became something he felt he had to outrun. He paused for a second before opening the door. I do not think I ever really saw what you were doing all those years, he said. His voice steady, not filled with regret, just clarity. I looked at him and smiled slightly. You saw it, I said. You just did not understand it yet, he nodded, accepting that, not arguing with it. Outside the night air was cool, the neighborhood quiet. I stepped onto the driveway and turned back once, seeing them both standing in the doorway, not distant, not distracted, just present. And as I walked to my car, I realized that nothing I had done recently had created this change. It had all been built long before, through years of quiet work that no one had paid attention to, and now that it had finally been seen. It did not need to be explained anymore. It simply existed, steady, reliable, the same way it always had been. The weeks that followed did not bring celebration, they brought consistency, and that was something far more valuable, the kind of steady ground that only appears after uncertainty has been faced and understood. Mark no longer talked about expansion the way he used to. There were no quick plans, no rushed projections. Instead, he focused on strengthening what was already there, reviewing contracts more carefully, asking his team to slow down and double-check details that once would have been pushed aside. I saw him become more deliberate with every decision, not because he had lost confidence, but because he had learned that confidence without structure does not last. Vanessa changed in ways that were quieter but just as important. She began managing their household finances with the same care we had applied to the business, organizing accounts, reviewing statements, making sure everything had a place and a purpose. One afternoon she called me and asked if I could come by again, not for a problem, but for a conversation. When I arrived, she had a notebook open on the kitchen table, pages filled with notes, questions written in careful lines. She looked up at me and said, I want to understand how to prevent this from happening again. Not just for us, but for the kids someday. I sat down across from her and nodded. That is where it begins, I said, not in fixing what went wrong, but in preparing for what could. We spent the afternoon going through different scenarios, not dramatic ones, just realistic situations that most people avoid thinking about. How to protect income, how to structure assets, how to make sure the next generation would not have to learn these lessons the hard way. She listened closely, asking questions that showed she was no longer looking for reassurance, but for understanding. Later that evening, Mark joined us at the table, and for the first time the three of us were not reacting to a situation. We were building something intentionally, slowly, without pressure. He looked at the notes Vanessa had taken and then at me. I wish I had paid attention to this years ago, he said, his tone calm, not filled with regret, just awareness. I shook my head slightly. Most people do not, I replied. They only see the value when something tests it. He leaned back in his chair and looked around the kitchen, the same kitchen where conversations used to move too fast to settle into anything meaningful. It is strange, he said. All these years I thought success meant moving forward as quickly as possible. I thought slowing down meant falling behind. I folded my hands on the table and looked at him. Sometimes slowing down is the only way to see what you are actually building, I said. Otherwise you are just moving without direction. The room grew quiet after that, not uncomfortable, just reflective, the kind of silence that allows something to settle into place. Before I left, Vanessa closed her notebook carefully and placed it beside the blue folder, not tucked away, not hidden, but kept within reach, something to return to, something to use. As I walked out to my car that night, I realized that the biggest change had not been the policy itself, or even the situation it had resolved. It was the way they now approached everything around them, with attention, with care, with an understanding that real stability is built long before it is needed. And as I drove home through the quiet streets, I knew that what we had put in place would not just protect them once, it would guide them forward, quietly, steadily, the same way it always had been meant to months past without any urgency returning. And that was how I knew things had truly changed. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing needed to be rushed anymore. Mark business settled into a steady rhythm, not as fast as before, not as aggressive, but stronger in ways that were not always visible from the outside. Contracts were reviewed carefully, risks were measured instead of ignored, and decisions were made with a quiet understanding of what could happen if they were not. Vanessa continued her own quiet transformation. The notebook she had once filled with questions became something she returned to regularly, not out of fear, but out of habit, a way to stay grounded, a way to remember what had been learned when everything felt uncertain. One Sunday afternoon they invited me over again, nothing formal. Just lunch, the kind that does not require planning or impressing anyone. The children were playing in the backyard, their voices carrying through the open door, light, carefree, untouched by everything that had happened. And I realized that this was what all of it had been for, not the business, not the numbers, but this, the ability for life to continue without interruption, without fear quietly shaping every decision. We sat at the table together. No folders this time, no. Documents spread out between us, just plates and conversation that moved naturally. Mark looked at me at one point and said, "I finally understand what you meant all those years." I tilted my head slightly, letting him continue. He paused for a moment as if choosing his words carefully. "You were never trying to sell something. You were trying to protect something." I nodded once. "That is all it has ever been," I said. Vanessa glanced at the blue folder sitting on a shelf nearby. Not hidden, not tucked away, just there, part of the room now. "We keep it there on purpose," she said quietly, "so we do not forget." I followed her gaze for a second before looking back at them. "You will not forget," I replied, not because of the folder, but because of what it represents. The room settled into a comfortable silence after that, not heavy, not reflective in a painful way, just calm, the kind of calm that comes from knowing things are in place. When I stood to leave later that afternoon, Mark walked me to my car again, the same simple gesture that had once been routine and had now become something intentional. He opened the door for me and then paused, looking at me with a steady expression. "I used to think success was about how much you could build," he said. "Now I think it is about what you can keep." I placed my hand on the door for a moment before getting in. "It is both," I said, "but one does not last without the other." He nodded slowly, not needing anything more than that. As I drove away, I glanced once in the rearview mirror and saw them standing there together, not waving, not calling out, just watching quietly, and I realized that there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to correct. Everything that needed to be understood had already taken its place. And as the road stretched out ahead of me, I felt the same steady certainty I had carried for years, unchanged, unaffected by whether anyone noticed it or not, because the value of what I had built was never dependent on recognition. It was always there, working quietly in the background, holding things together when it mattered most.